weekend after the budget, we're all trying to digest the fine print of the budget and try and understand what the economic priorities were laid out by the government. One of the things, of course, was the farm scheme, and then there was the focus on the fiscal deficit as usual. Joining us to speak about some of that is Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Dr. Subramanian, thank you for joining us. Lovely to have you here on Bloomberg Quint. I'm going to start, Dr. Subramanian, with getting your view on... let me ask you for what your view on the thrust of the budget was. It did seem like there was an underlying attempt to keep consumption strong. Was that, according to you, the key message in the government, from the government?
For me, I think the budget was a culmination of the emphasis on the middle class and the farmers and the poor that has been continuing over the last 4.5 years. Just to give you some background, if you consider inflation, the rate of inflation in December 2018 was 2.19%. If you look at the average rate of inflation that has prevailed over the last 5 years, that has been about 4%. If the rates of inflation that had been there in 2014, which is about 10%, had prevailed, then the middle class would have been looking at many essential commodities being about 30% costlier. Also, rate of inflation being lower affects the real rate of savings. So when the rates of inflation were about 10%, the savers were looking at a negative real rates of saving of about -2% or worse. In which case, therefore, the money that they were putting in for savings, they were getting much less purchasing power going forward. In contrast, with the rates of inflation being about 4% now, the real rates of saving are actually positive, about 3%, and therefore a change of about 5% at least in the real rate of savings has translated into at least a 25% increase in the purchasing power. A final point for the middle class, which is important, and I'll come to what has been done in the budget just after I finish this, which is that the GST, and what is important for every consumer to keep in mind is that because the GST is computed on the value added, what the GST rate that is shown on the product is not what is the relevant number. It is the actual rupees that they pay. So just to give you an estimate, if a middle class consumer was using about 8,500 as part of their budget on essential commodities, then that middle class consumer saves about 320 rupees per month in the taxes that are saved. So together, these were the steps that have been taken on the middle class. Now, in this budget, with the increase in the slab, the income tax slab, from a taxable income of 2.5 lakhs to 5 lakhs, what you're looking at is that middle class consumers and middle class taxpayers with income up to 7.5, or even 8 lakhs, if they have a home loan, they can actually be they can save paying taxes, which is a substantial benefit. This we are looking at least 50 to 60% of the filers of taxes being exempt from paying taxes. So that's number one, the middle class. Number two, the farmers. The emphasis on the direct income transfer is which has been initiated in this budget is, to me, an important change, and I'll explain why. Number one, you have to remember that this is above and beyond what is already being done through several other schemes, be it the minimum support policy, price policy, be it the interest subvention, the priority sector loans, the Fasal Bima Yojana, and the others. But what is critical here is because leading up to the budget, there had been debate about a debt waiver. In fact, today I've also read about political parties talking about debt debt waivers, there are two important concerns with debt waivers. Number one, only someone who's taken a loan from the formal financial system can benefit if there is a debt waiver. But more importantly, debt waivers have pernicious effects. A research paper of mine that has gotten published in the Journal of Law and Economics, where we examine the effects of the UPA debt waiver of 2008, what we find is that the debt waiver benefits from that get cornered by those who do not deserve such waivers. More importantly, such waivers actually create significant moral hazard. And number three, after a waiver, irrespective of whatever directions are given by the government, the actual credit that flows to the farmers, that decreases. So these are the negative effects of a debt waiver. In contrast, when you have an income transfer, what is important here is that the choice about how that money has to be spent by the farmer is up to the farmer. And here it is important to also contrast with the minimum support policy, for instance. So, if you remember, up until 2014, the minimum support prices for rice and wheat had increased significantly, which affected the production of pulses. The broader point here is that minimum support prices affect the cropping patterns of farmers.
Right.
In contrast, an income transfer is something that actually the farmer can utilize on his own, and therefore there is significant benefit for the farmers as well.
Let me put a counterpoint to you on that farm sector point. Okay, I completely get that farm loan waivers are not, something that we should go towards. That point is entirely taken. Now, the scheme is a large fiscal cost at an aggregate, 75,000 crore for next year. But if you come down to the unit level, the transfer is at the end of the day 500 rupees a month, right? So there are people who have argued that you're taking on a very large administrative exercise when that same money could perhaps have been pushed through to the rural economy via the existing schemes. That seems like a reasonable critique of this.
So I think again, it's important to look at some numbers here. If we go and read the report by the Niti Aayog on doubling farm income, what they've shown is the average farmer, in today's money, the annual income is about 45,000 rupees. Okay. Now this is an average farmer. We know very well that the small and marginal farmers actually constitute about 65 to 70% of the average farmers. And the income of a small and marginal farmer is at least half, or maybe even worse than that of a larger farmer. So if you estimate from here the fact that the average income is about 45,000 rupees, you're looking at, and my estimate suggests that a small and marginal farmer would be looking at an annual income of about 35,000 rupees. 6,000 rupees as of, for basically that farmer is 16.66%. That's not a trivial number at all. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. Remember also that the small and marginal farmers constitute a big part of the farming community. Therefore, an increase of that, and this is assured income. Why is the assured income important? Because it actually reduces the risk for the farmer. So if you look at the risk return trade-off, you are assured actually an increase of at least 16 to 17% of income. More importantly, when the farmer faces some adverse shocks, this 16.6% actually can be significantly more, because it actually takes care of important risks, and thereby the risk return trade-off for the small and marginal farmers is altered in a material manner, and that is something that we should not be actually keeping, we should not sort of ignore here, because these are significant numbers given the annual income of the small and marginal farmer at whom this has been targeted at.
Sure. Okay, let me look at the broader picture on this, which is the fiscal cost. Now, obviously, the government has said, it's made provisions within last year's budget for 20,000 crore and 75,000 crore. But, this is going to be a recurring cost. Without a commensurate increase in tax revenues, can one continue to hope to fund it through non-tax revenue, for instance, divestment, the hope of a larger, dividend from either public sector enterprises or the Reserve Bank of India? If it's a recurring liability, then should there not be a proper game plan on funding it?
So, on the fiscal numbers, I think what is important to keep in mind here is that, and I have been observing this from the outside as well before I assumed this role, that the projections generally by this government on the fiscal numbers has been quite realistic. It is important to keep in mind also that the fiscal deficit numbers that have been arrived at are based on the older numbers. If you remember, on Thursday the CSO introduced revised GDP numbers, which have revised the GDP numbers significantly upwards. If you take those numbers, we are looking at a GDP of 225 lakh crores, which then translates into actual fiscal deficit numbers being lower than what has been projected in the budget. That is number one, something that we need to keep in mind. Number two, I think if we look at overall revenues, whether it's direct taxes or indirect taxes, I do understand that the GST collections have been lower, and in fact that is important to keep in mind in terms of the fiscal math. Compared to the actual 6 lakh crore projection for GST, the actual numbers that have been taken in the budget is 5 lakh crores. That also goes back to the realistic assumptions that are being made. Now, to come back to GST, this has been, if you look worldwide, whenever the GST is introduced, it takes some time for it to stabilize. The reductions have been because of concessions that have been given over the last year as well. Once GST stabilizes, some of the benefits that we've talked about, especially the use of the input tax credit, which for various reasons, especially some of the difficulties in implementing it, have not been, we've not been able to carry it forward. But once that comes in, and I hope that will be reasonably soon, the GST collections are bound to go up. Number two, the direct tax collections, I think post demonetization, we've had significant increase in the tax base, the people who are coming under the tax net. I do hear your concern, but the government is seized of the matter, at least in the deliberations that I've seen, and therefore, the emphasis on both direct and indirect taxes is being played, especially if you look at the ease in compliance that was announced in the budget. The fact that a lot of taxpayers can actually deal with it online. In fact, as the finance minister mentioned in his budget speech, 99.54% of all returns are being processed online. That ease of compliance, academic research shows that when ease of compliance increases, the tax base also increases, and therefore the steps that have been taken, in this budget to have returns, and refunds actually being done within 24 hours, those will ease the compliance burden significantly and would, work towards increasing the tax bracket. So I do not remain that concerned about the fiscal math. As I've already pointed out, these numbers should actually be something that is, that we can take care of. It is a recurring expenditure, but something that is important because the farmers, needed this intervention. Realize that when you have a population that is growing at less than 1% and the production of foods growing at more than 3%, you will have surplus food. And surplus food then means actually, lower prices as well, which then means that the returns for the farmers are not commensurate with the effort that is being put in. So this is something that is important and that we have to provide for, even if it is recurring, and create that space by through revenues to provide for it.
Okay, so on the fiscal deficit, the other concern that is emerging is the significant jump in extra budgetary resources, whether it's CPSCs till last year and increasingly Food Corporation of India, the extra budgetary resources they're raising. It seems like to meet the fiscal math, that cost is being diverted elsewhere.
So I think viewers realize that the government of India follows the cash method of accounting, and therefore these items do not appear in the fiscal deficit because they're below the line. That said, what is important to keep in mind is that providing for some of these important investments through budgetary resources would actually take time. In contrast, when you provide for some of these investments through balance sheet financing and off budget financing, when they are invested in areas where the fiscal multiplier is significant, then you actually generate a lot better return for that, rather than having to wait for budgetary resources to be created. So I am not quite that worried about it, because these are investments where the fiscal multiplier should be significant. What you also must take into account is that a lot of the fiscal math is also being driven by the increase in the small savings fund, which ties back to what I mentioned earlier. Because the real rate of savings has increased, the inflow into the NSS has actually increased significantly, and that is actually indication to me of savings from the middle class actually coming in. Some of it will be used by the government, and some of it actually then will also go into the private sector.
That's on the National Small Savings Fund. I was referring, sir, a little bit more to the large borrowings by the Food Corporation of India. The reason it becomes relevant is because it seems like it is subsidy arrears which have not been paid, which are forcing FCI to borrow a lot more, either from the Small Savings Fund or from other market sources.
No, I think that concern of yours, Ira, is valid. The government is trying to make the best effort to ensure that these subsidies are targeted better. If we look at the use of the DBT, Direct Benefit Transfer Scheme, there has been about 6 lakh crores of DBT payments that have been made, be it on the fertilizer or other subsidies, and the savings have been 1 lakh crores. So relating to what I was saying earlier, even those that extra budgetary money that is being raised through, for instance, FCI or other public sector enterprises, when the effort is to try and streamline these expenditures, I would be less worried. We definitely have more work to do on trying to streamline them further, but I would suffice to actually and summarize to say that when you need to make investments in relevant sectors, rather than having to wait for budgetary resources to be created, the off-balance sheet financing, actually the multipliers from that are higher. And secondly, there is already an effort to streamline these expenditures better using DBT.
Sure. Something you alluded to earlier, which was the revisions in the GDP data. We have now seen 2 large revisions, first in the back data of the new series and now just in this revised data. As an economist, I just want to get your sense of what's going on, why economic data has become, so volatile. Nothing else. It becomes a bit of a policy headache, right? If we continue to see very large revisions, then it sort of, throws policy off track.
So I think what we have to keep in mind are a few points. Number one, in India, the apparatus for measuring GDP is done by professionals. These are professionals like people like you and me who work in the CSO. Number two, the current changes are actually being implemented based on the recommendations made by a committee that was headed by a reputed academic, retired academic from the Delhi School of Economics, and includes other panel of experts as well, all of whom are independent-minded and are experts in that subject. This is something that is important. Number three, the process of measuring GDP, trying to measure it better, is a continuous process. For instance, in this set of revisions, what is being done is new data sources are being brought in, newer proxies are being used. To give you an example, for instance, to measure value added in the telecom sector, earlier the number of subscribers were being used to measure that. Instead, now in the new data series, the number of minutes of usage is being used. Now, I think it's very clear that compared to number of subscribers, the number of minutes of usage is clearly an instance of better data being used to measure activity. And in similar manners, there are a bunch of other improvements that have been done. An important aspect to keep in mind is that an unanticipated and an unexpected shock came in the form of demonetization. So the data has to actually get tuned to the economic changes that have happened as a result of demonetization. Because remember, demonetization plus GST is actually putting in process formalization of the economy. And as it is, our GDP data have not been capturing as well some of the informal sectors of the economy. So the effort is essentially to try and capture those parts of the economy that were not being measured as well, and that is why these data series are being used. I must emphasize that this is being done by independent people. If I was someone who's actually as part of that team that was doing this, I would actually feel a little disappointed by the by allusions that this is politically motivated, because this is something that is being done by a team of experts, professionals, and we have to have that trust in their ability to be able to do the activity actually in a professional manner.
All right. Sir, I have time for one last issue, and I really do want to get your views on this. We didn't have an economic survey this year. Otherwise, perhaps we would have had a proper sort of, economic debate about jobs in the economy, what's going on with the various data sources, some not being released like the NSSO report, and also, what is our strategy for job creation? What are your thoughts as CEA, both on the controversies around the data, but also on the larger debate that we really need to have?
So, Ira, I think there are 3 or 4 points that we must keep in mind when we talk about employment. Number one, in the Indian context, focusing on the unemployment number, in my opinion, misses the point, because a large proportion of the workforce is in the unorganized sector. And therefore, the bigger question to ask here is not about unemployment, is about actually meaningful employment. Therefore, a half a percentage point change here or there in unemployment is not the ones that actually we should be really worried about. We should really be thinking about how to create jobs, meaningful jobs for the, for our youth. Number two, as an economist, I actually believe that something that gets measured more frequently leads to better policy. Earlier, we had actually, we didn't have an apparatus for measuring jobs, frequently. It was being done over 5 years. Now the processes have been put in place to measure this more frequently. In fact, the fact that, some of the leaked data that has come and the debate that has been created is because we're actually making an effort to measure this, more importantly. In fact, I've written on this, I had written a Times of India op-ed couple of years back on this exact thing, that we need to create the apparatus. Now to come to the main question of jobs and employment. I think there's number one, what is important to keep in mind is that jobs are both a supply and a demand side phenomenon. Supply is basically firms that supply the jobs. Demand comes from people who are skilled enough to be able to take those jobs. And we all realize that skilling is a process that does not happen overnight. It takes time. It's a phenomenon that actually happens over time. Therefore, the emphasis on skilling that is being done and on human capital creation that is being done will start showing impact going forward. Those impacts will come in the medium term. In the short run, what I actually am observing is an important change. If you observed, let's say, 10 years back, a lot of the youth would be looking to win that lottery of getting a government job. It is a lottery because the numbers that of jobs available compared to people who are looking for it is very large. Now, and therefore they would skill themselves accordingly, for competitive exams to get into government. But the skill sets that are actually required to work in the private sector or maybe to start your own firm is very different. And therefore, after 28 or 29, the youth would start reskilling themselves after finding out that they're not getting a government job. This culture is changing slowly but surely. In particular, what you're observing is startups. We now have the second largest ecosystem for startups in the world. And you and I, we all see tangibly the jobs that those create, whether it's actually an Ola or actually a Swiggy. When we order food, let's say in our office, these are people who come and deliver. They're creating tangible jobs. These startups are creating jobs. In fact, you just think about that counterfactual. If a Swiggy was not there, those people who are applying those, that food that we need, they wouldn't have had those jobs. So that is an important change that is happening, and therefore, policies, we should be, doubling down on policies to try and really further the startup ecosystem, because going forward, they are the ones that will create a lot of jobs. A final point, something that we are thinking about here, which is that in our country we have labor markets that are quite fragmented. So, on the one hand, there are employers who are looking for jobs, and on the other hand, in particular geographies, and there are others, people who are willing to work but possibly not getting jobs where they want. Here's where actually, government can play a role, and thoughts are on to try and think about how we can integrate this. So there are steps that are, going on, focusing on the startup ecosystem, ensuring that there is greater skilling and human capital creation that gets done. These will start showing effects, going forward. I think it is important to keep in mind that this is a process that does not happen overnight.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll leave it there, but appreciate you taking the time to speak to us on some aspects of the budget and the economy. I look forward to another conversation. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Thanks for watching Bloomberg Quint.